Hi everybody, Mrs. Dunn here. We're going to talk about the composition of functions today. Specifically, what I want you to learn is how to find the composition of two functions, how to find the domain of the composition of two functions, and how to decompose a function. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing I want to point out is this idea of composition of functions. So this expression right here, the way you would pronounce that is you would say f of g of x. And what f of g of x is equal to is just like it said, f of g of x. You know, like sometimes we find f of 3 and that means plug 3 into a function. Well, f of g of x means plug g of x into the f function. Once again, that's best if we look at a specific example. So if we take these two functions, f of x is equal to 2x plus 3, and g of x is equal to x squared minus 1, well then, f of g of x means to find f of x squared minus 1, because g of x is equal to x squared minus 1, and we're plugging the g function into the f function. Well, the f function is 2x plus 3, so I put a parenthesis where that x was, and x squared minus 1 is going to fill that parenthesis. Okay, so then all you have to do is do the distributive property, 2x squared minus 2 plus 3, and simplify that. And so the answer is that f of g of x is equal to 2x squared plus 1. Okay, let's look at another type of example. So in this example, instead of me just asking you for f of g of x, here I'm asking you for f of g of 2, a specific value. And just like before, that means f of g of 2. So I'm going to plug 2 into the g function, get that answer, and plug it into f. So look, g of 2 is equal to 2 squared minus 1, 4 minus 1, which is 3. And then I'm going to take that answer and plug it into f. So f of 3, I'm using 3 because that's what I got for g of 2. F of 3 is equal to 2 times 3 plus 3, or 6 plus 3, which is 9. Okay, now, so that means f of g of 2 is equal to 9. Okay, now, the next thing we want to do is talk about the domain of these functions. So I want to do two domains here. So I want you to find the domain of f of g of x and the domain of g of f of x. Okay, so we're going to start with f of g of x. So to find the domain of this composite function, we have to think about not only the domain of the composite function, which we can find the composite function, then find the domain of it, but we have to think about the domain of g. Well, the domain of g is, so like I said, one is g of x undefined and one is f of g of x undefined. And g of x is undefined when x is less than -8. So the domain of g of x goes from -8, and we can use -8 because we can find the square root of 0, all the way up to infinity. All right, so what about f of g of x? If we plug g into the f function, we get the square root of x plus 8 plus 1. And once again, that domain is -8 to infinity, and we can include -8. Okay, making sense, I hope. Now let's switch gears and let's look at the domain of g of f of x. Well, we have to consider the domain of f of x, which in this case is all real numbers. And then we have to look at g of f of x. So in this problem, we're putting f into g. So f is x plus 1, and that's going into the g function. So it's the square root of x plus 1 plus 8. When we simplify that, we get the square root of x plus 9. And the domain of this function goes from negative 9 to infinity. And negative 9 is part of that domain. All right, so the next thing and the last thing we're doing in this screencast is talking about decomposing functions. So consider you have some function h of x, which is defined as f of g of x. And you know that h of x is equal to 1 over x minus 2. You're being asked to find f of x and find g of x. You're decomposing it. Think about that for a minute. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint. So what if I tell you that f of x is equal to 1 over x? Well, remember, by definition, the f of g of x is, it means plug g into the f function. Well, if the f function is 1 over x, and we want the answer to look like 1 over x minus 2, what does g of x have to be? So think about that. And did you guess x minus 2? I hope so. So f of x is equal to 1 over x, and g of x is equal to x minus 2. That's not the only way that you can do this, but that's one way that works. All right, I wish you a lot of luck, and if you have any questions, be sure to send me an email. Good luck.